There's been quite a lot of work previously looking into job sharing, and quite a lot of that has been in the public sector. And whenever we've spoken about it out in the marketplace with clients and collaborators, there's been a general sort of the shutters go down. You know, there's absolutely no way that it could work here in this kind of organisation in a global marketplace. So we knew anecdotally that there were lots of pockets of really corking examples of job sharing in private sector in great senior roles, but that was the challenge, that they were just little pockets, so they weren't actually there was no consolidated critical mass in any one organisation. So we stepped up to the plate and said, right, that's what we're going to do. We're going to go out and we're going to consolidate, we're going to find all these examples, we're going to put them into one big pot and demonstrate, A, they exist, and actually look, they exist not only in private sector but in organisations like yours, and also in roles where you never would have thought they would work. And then, as Val said, we wanted to then analyse them and understand, well, you know, what actually does best practice look like? How are they making it work in these kind of roles? And then finally, for our sponsors, consolidating that into practical guides so that we can actually understand how to implement it. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Lucy. We'll kickstart the research.
Thank you, Sarah. And as you'll see, in the spirit of the day, we're job sharing the presentation here. Yes. Just hope it goes all right.
Good practice.
Okay, so yes, what I was going to start by saying was that job sharing has been around for some time. In fact, my co-researcher, Pam Walton, gave me this morning. This is the first guide to job sharing, which came out in the UK exactly 30 years ago, this year, interestingly. I think what's interesting about this particular study is that this is by far the biggest study that's ever taken place in the UK, and it looks at people at senior levels, in particular in client-facing roles. So it's a very interesting study from that point of view. Because it was such a big study, what I would encourage you to do is, we've done a summary report, which you'll get at the end of today, but there's also a very large, yes, we've got, but there's also an even larger, fuller report on a PDF version, which you can download from the website after today, okay? But basically, we looked at two groups. We looked at job sharers themselves, and then we wanted to look at take a 360-degree view. So we also looked at managers of job sharers, people who work with job sharers, people who work in organisations where they know job sharing exists. So it was two quite large studies from that perspective. We're just going to skim across the findings today and really talk about the who, the why, and the what they did next. And later on, you're going to be hearing from our panel of people who have indeed job shared, which will be by far the most interesting part, I'm sure. But just to begin with the target audience, we very much succeeded in reaching our target, which was people in senior roles, people who'd been in work for perhaps 10 years or more in senior roles and in managerial or directorial positions. As I say, I'm not going to dwell on these for too long because there's a lot of information to get through, but I hope you can see from these slides that a large proportion were in those senior manager or even director and partner roles. And here's some examples of the sort of organisations that they worked in and the sort of jobs that they did. So very much what we wanted to achieve, the client-facing people, you know, working in private sector businesses. And I think those represented about 80% of all the organisations we looked at. Now, the high proportion of them were also in managerial roles, 83% of them managing smaller teams, but very often at very senior level. The person we spoke to who managed the most people, I think, managed 490, so, you know, quite a large group there. Interestingly, we found that the average length of a job share was just 2 years. It's not something people do and stay in, which is often a presupposition. 2 years was the average, and people very often then moved on to do something else. I think around about 30% of our job sharers went on to apply to do a second job sharer. Some did 3 or more. I think the most was 5 in all. So that was an interesting finding, that it's not necessarily something people do for a very long time. It's something that they do to manage a period in their lives when they have other issues as well. And just as an example, I think it's often thought that job sharing is for mums with babies, particularly perhaps when the second baby comes around. And although that was certainly true in our findings, that it's a sort of major family change which causes people to look at job sharing and often pair up with another person with a baby, it's certainly not the only example. On the one hand, we had someone in a very senior UK-wide role job sharing because she had a baby, but job sharing with a man who had elder care issues, who wanted to be able to have longer weekends to help elderly parents living at a distance. We had a very senior job sharing chief executive who said that he had decided he wanted to job share just because he wanted a more holistic life, rather than the very long hours, which Sarah was mentioning earlier as being an issue. So people wanting more time for other interests. We had one trailing spouse who said, who I spoke to, who turned out to be talking to me from Ankara in Turkey, who was job sharing because his partner was working there and he was actually working remotely with a partner in London. So a really interesting range of job share examples there. Now, about 45% of our job sharers decided to go for promotion as a job share. As I said earlier, a lot of people just do it for a short time and then move on to something else. But 45%, 55% applied and decided to go for promotion. And of those, a very high proportion were successful. And this was an interesting finding for us, because I think people often feel it won't work here, it won't be well received, it will be too difficult. But what this suggested was that if you're very can-do about it and go for it, you're likely to be successful. 71% who did apply were successful in going even higher up their organisations. So at that point, I'm going to hand over again to Sarah to talk about the job design.
Thank you. And also the statistic around the fact that 71% of the survey had gained promotion gave us the confidence too to know that our population were high performing, so therefore we feel that we can say best practice when we talk about it. So I'm going to come back to the definition of what is job share, because actually previous definitions had defined job sharing as two people who are fundamentally interchangeable in a job. So they're interchangeable doing one whole or full-time job. And our findings were, we were really struck with the output of the project, is that actually our findings showed that this isn't the case. Job sharing is not really as we know it, particularly in senior roles, and that there is more than one way to design a job share. I'm just going to let you just absorb that slide before I start talking to it. So we had 86 job sharers that we both surveyed and interviewed. And we analysed their jobs, and we analysed how they set the job share up and how they made it work. And we came out with, actually, there are really 3 distinct definitions or categorisations for job sharing. So we've named them pure, hybrid and split. So the pure is the job sharing that we all know of and how we all naturally perceive job sharing to be, where you've got 2 or more people doing one job, there's joint liability, one job just so happens to be done by 2 different people, and they are, as the term suggests, interchangeable. So it's a pure job share arrangement. At the far end of the scale, we found a number of different examples where one job that was in its original form, one job description, to enable it to actually be done on a job share basis, it'd been split in two. Now they still ultimately had the shared business objectives, but they had independent liability, and they effectively were doing, they divided responsibilities. They were doing separate projects, separate responsibilities, separate activities. So, I mean, it is in effect two people doing one job, but ultimately that job was, two people doing two separate jobs, but ultimately that job was originally one job, and they still have the same business objectives. The most interesting finding we felt was that actually around about 60% of our job sharers fell into what we've defined as the hybrid category. The majority of most senior job sharers that we found were hybrid job sharers. Now, hybrid is where we've said joint and several liability, forgive the legal pun, but basically where there's one job description, they have joint liability for that overall objective of that role, for that job. But each individual plays to their own strengths, capabilities and expertise. So they actually divide certain aspects of the job by the expertise of the individual. So they play to each other's strengths. So let me explain that in a little bit more detail. Again, this is all in your report, so and it's quite a lot to take in. So if you have any questions afterwards, then come and see us, come and have a chat. So just talking through this again, just working our way from the pure, just to explain this slide, we've divvied it up. So the first row is we've identified what's shared in the role, and then we've identified what's actually then divided. So if you take a pure job share, again, this is the one where they're interchangeable. You can call each other, everyone calls them the same name. They don't really know the difference, they share an email, etc. So they've got one job description, and a really critical point is that they have the same level of capabilities and expertise, so that it's fully fluid. Typically, the only split is actually the share itself, so whether that be by geography, by time, by hour, by week, that's the only thing that's divided. So then moving across to the hybrid, now the difference here is where you've got one single role, you've still got the same business objectives, you've got a single set of accountabilities, but what's different here is that you've actually got, it's not necessarily the same capabilities and skill sets for both partnerships. But what's important is that you have complementary. And on average, there'll be about 40% will have the same, 40% of will have shared and similar levels of expertise, but the majority, they'll have different levels of expertise. So it might be, for example, in an HR director role, one person might be a lot stronger on policy and law, and the other might be a lot stronger on talent management, etc. So that they each take the lead. So the key thing with the hybrid is that it's complementary. They have shared. Ultimately, they have shared business objectives. They will have some shared performance metrics and accountabilities, but they also have divided and individual independent performance metrics. So moving on to the split, really the critical difference here is effectively it's one job split into two, and that they have different capabilities. So to give you an example, there was a senior project management role, a senior program manager role in a bank, and was a full-time role, one FTE, and was being done by one FTE. She wanted to work part-time, found a partner, and they split the role. Ultimately, they had the same reporting, same objectives for the ultimate role, but they split it in two. One it was a technical and change management kind of program management role. One focus had much more greater strength in technical. The other had greater strength in change management. So they split it down the middle, and each did their separate part. And ultimately, they sort of reported into the same. So effectively, they were doing two separate part-time roles. It's quite a lot to take in, but do you get the concept? This is probably everyone in the steering group has said that this is probably one of the best findings that we've the most insightful, enlightened findings that we've taken from the project. Right, it's over to you now. Partner.
Well, of the 86 job sharers who responded to our survey, from those we interviewed 20, and you'll be hearing from some of them later, and they're going to be going into the detail of how they went about it and some of the tips that they want to share with you. What I just want to highlight here are some of the habits of the top job sharers that we deduced, what the pros and cons were for people, and what some of the reasons for partnerships to fail were. So just some headlines around that. So first of all, the high achieving job sharers are a fascinating cocktail of both being ambitious, high energy, high achieving individuals, but people who are prepared to cover for rather than compete with their colleagues. So they're quite mature leaders in their own right, who are prepared to take accountability, who are quite prepared to take a leadership role, but they're prepared to share both the limelight and when things go wrong and cover for each other in that sense. Sometimes, just occasionally, they might say that they wouldn't necessarily agree with everything their job share partner said, but they kept their mouths shut in terms of the outside world. So that very strong trust and communication, the ability to share responsibility, and having that accountability. And I think the other thing which really struck us was that commitment to the role and ability to be a little bit flexible about their time. So seeing a few nods in the room here. Obviously, if you're working in a very high pressure environment in the city, the chances are you're going to be working in a long hours culture. As a job sharer at a senior level, you're going to have to mirror that. It's no good thinking that job sharing is going to be a good option if you want to have fairly rigid hours. You're still going to need to put in the prorated overtime. And most of our job sharers certainly had around about 3 hours overlap agreed in their jobs, but many of them said they did put in extra time. They weren't necessarily waiting for calls on their non-work days, but they were very happy to have a text message perhaps to say, can you talk, I just need to check something with you. They were prepared for that sort of level of communication. That was, I would say, one of the very important things. And significantly, those were people who I noticed also had very good informal backup care, perhaps in addition to formal childcare arrangements, for example. They perhaps had a mum or a partner working from home who was able to pick up the slack to enable them to have that flexibility, which I think is an interesting issue and raises questions about the possibility, say, for lone parents without that support. Anyway, those are some of the common factors, and we'll look forward to hearing from our job sharers later on. What about the pros and cons of job sharing? I think that everybody said, although it had been very hard work achieving a job share at senior level, it was absolutely worth it for the fact that they were able to do a big job on a part-time basis. Too often we see, I mean, other forms of flexible working have grown in recent years, obviously, but all too often part-timers do tend to find that they lose touch. Job sharers said they felt more part of the team. They felt fairly happy that their job share partner was holding the reins in their absence, rather like sharing the helm of a ship, which meant that they could switch off after their handover. The other thing they all said was that they brought huge energy to the job. The person coming in, say, in the middle of the week was as fresh as a Monday person. In fact, my biggest concern about this study was for the people working with the job sharers who were beginning to flag by Thursday and had a kind of keen person driving them on. So I think as well as that, above all else, the time factor, being able to have time. And one person's put it very neatly in that she said, okay, I see my colleagues, this is a con if you like to job sharing, I see my colleagues moving faster up the career ladder, getting promotion more quickly. They've invested in that. I'm investing in time at the moment, and that works for me because of other issues, other things that are important, which I'm ambitious for in my life as well. So that is the downside. Career progression may be slower. You are going to have to push very hard to overcome perceptions about job sharing. Often job sharing can be blamed when things go wrong, that may be very unfair. It does mean, as I said, if you work in a long hours culture, your job sharing is going to have an element of long hours about it as well. Just to very quickly touch on some of the other reasons that things fail. A lot of this comes down to communication and trust between job sharers. But also I think it's about management attitude, not being supportive, people perhaps losing the confidence around the job share and the possibility of progressing. Often if job sharing is imposed, perhaps one person wanted to job share but there wasn't a partner and someone else is told instead of a full-time job they have job sharing as an option. If it's not well thought through, that can also lead to difficulties. As I said, a lot of this is in the report itself, so you'll be able to read about that in more detail. But in the meantime, I'm going to hand back to my job sharer here, Lucy.
Yes, there's so much here that we could have had a whole day conference, but we think we might bore you a little bit. So interesting. In terms of sourcing and matching, one of the big barriers that wasn't mentioned just now, particularly for individuals, when they're going through the thought process of actually considering how to move to a part-time arrangement, is either job sharing is just not even considered because of the general perception, it's not done here, or they just can't see anybody that they work with in their organisation that could be a potential job sharer. So we did some further digging and we asked the job sharers how they were appointed, on what basis, did they know their job sharer beforehand? And we found that a significant number, so 46%, so nearly half, had no idea who the job share partners were before. They'd never worked with them, which I think is quite an interesting, so it really sort of dispels that myth that actually you've got to know that bit. You would have had to have sat next to that person for the last 5 years before you can actually job share with them. What came out as a critical matching criteria, again picking up on the hybrid format, was not that they really needed to have an exact match in expertise and skills, so they don't need to be a carbon copy of you. That's that's frequently we hear it at Cambridge Jane, where you start talking about it to an individual, and once you've got over that, well, it can be done in your job, and then it's, well, God, you're never going to find anyone like me, and you then start sort of breaking down the barriers, peeling away the onion a little bit, and say, well. And what it comes down to is that, number one, they have to be, without doubt, a high performer. And in fact, in some organisations, we found that it wasn't even offered to individuals who weren't high performing. Without doubt, the skills can be different, the experience can be different, but the capabilities, they have to be complementary. And critical to the success of a partnership, no matter how short, how long, is that there was a personal chemistry between the two of them. They shared values and they shared career aspirations and motivations. Now, by that, I mean we've had sight of a number of job share partners that have just gone horribly wrong. And when we look back and analyse them, it was because right at the very beginning, the parameters of the job share partnership weren't really set out and agreed between the two of them. One individual, to just give you an example, One individual was using job sharing as a means to work part-time and just scale down a little bit while she focused on her family and everything else that she had going on in her life. And she was looking, and I'm going to use the word coast, but that's a bit derogatory, but she was looking just to sort of plateau for a bit. Whereas the other person was looking to use job sharing as a mechanism to work part-time, which she wanted to do because she had things going on outside, but she wanted to carry on going up her career. And she was really ambitious. And what ended up happening was that the other person was effectively sharing on her coattails. And it just didn't work because there was an incompatible match of motivations and drivers. The other area is where I say once you've got over the barrier, the onion peel, whatever, once you've got over it can be done in your job, and actually you don't have to know that individual. And then people say, well, I can't see anybody around here where I work. Now, we'll come on to what organisations are doing a bit later on, because some are investing in mechanisms to be able to have people meet each other and network. But an interesting finding for us was that 75% of individuals, these senior execs, found their partner by networking through the organisation. But a quarter of them actually found their partner outside of the organisation. And one in particular, they both applied as a job share partnership together for a role. So we thought that was really interesting. So we then went off and did another survey. And we surveyed 6,000 senior women to ask them, who were all looking for flexibility, to ask them what the appetite, how do they feel about job sharing, what's the appetite for job sharing. And a phenomenal 60% came back and said, we'd love the opportunity. So again, it was sort of breaking down that barrier that, number one, they can come outside of the organisation, and number two, there are lots of people out there that could be potential partners. I think this is me now, isn't it, again? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we identified a lot of barriers, a lot of costs, and a number of benefits. And the benefits are detailed out in the report that you'll get. But I've pulled out here two that we found the most compelling and for the business case for organisations. And they're really around the retention business case. Of the women in the study doing the job sharing, who were job sharers, 80%, a resounding 80%, 87% said that being able to job share meant the difference between staying and leaving. And I leave you with that stat. It's quite compelling. We then we're interested in understanding, well, what then within our global organisations, what's the appetite amongst our senior women for job sharing? We've already gone externally and asked. So of the women's networks that we surveyed across the 7 global organisations, a phenomenal 61% were interested in the opportunity to job share. Which, my mouth was nearly on the floor when I saw that stat, so silence says it for me. It's very detailed. I'm not asking you to look at this in detail, but we basically pulled together the costs and the benefits, and just so that we could understand when HR or individuals are taking the case to management, what does it actually look like? Now, without doubt, and there's no question about it, job sharing does cost more. It just does. And best practice shows that the best form of job shares were 1.2 FTEs, so it's 1.2 FTE cost. But what we found with the job shares, the managers, the organisations employing those job shares, actually, unsurprisingly, the benefits did outweigh the cost. As a steering group, when we were looking at these numbers, the things that really jumped out to us that everybody said were the most important benefits in terms of, so we have kind of the job share retention and then a replacement if that person were to leave, was the retention of corporate knowledge. So we're talking about individuals that have at least 10 years experience working in the business. The retention of client relationships, hugely important for professional services and B2B organisations. The retention of that investment in training ranged from an average of around 25,000 up to the law firms, which a phenomenal sort of 400k spend. We also found an interesting statistic that had been done a number of years ago around productivity, that had looked at productivity of job share partnerships compared to full-time employees, and they found that there was an increase in 30% in terms of productivity. So that, I mean, they're all good stats once you've got over that hurdle of acceptance that it could be an option. Again, this details in the long research report, which you can download on the internet.
So, can I see 5 minutes to panel?
Oh, whoops. Okay.
Well, yes. Just finally, we wanted to touch on some of the barriers and best practices that we found in organisations. Now, again, this was largely as a result of the managers' views on what their organisations were doing and the job sharers' views. And in terms of barriers, by far the biggest issue amongst both job sharers and managers was leadership attitude and culture. There is still a lot of lip service paid to these issues, but behind the scenes, senior management don't really fully understand job sharing, and there's this, particularly at middle management level as well, a fear factor that it won't work here, who's going to be held accountable. A lot of more learning needed around how to make it work, and reassurance that it can and does work by having role models and guidance for managers, which I think is going to be even more important as companies cut back on their HR role and rely more and more on the intranet services to provide that information. I'm just going to point to those because they were by far the biggest issues: the lack of information and attitude.
There are, in terms of just finding leading practice, and a lot of this is in your report, we actually struggled, but there are lots of different practices happening across lots of different organisations, so we pulled it all together. And just to pull out some, a number of organisations have invested significantly in online portals, not just for job sharing but also for flexible working as an enabler to for internal communications, but are now investing in specific communications around job sharing and using the internal comms channels to start drip feeding job sharing as a viable option. And obviously our sponsors have invested in the toolkits, so that's definitely leading practice. Just a couple of, to pull out here, the measuring the FTE versus headcount is a massive issue and a blocker in lots of organisations. So there are some that have actually engaged the CFO, given them a bit of a nudge, and they're now reverting back to headcount by FTE. Some organisations are looking at internal job boards, although it hasn't really gained traction for a couple of reasons. One, there hasn't been a traction of job sharing in the organisation, and two, a little bit about confidentiality, people not wanting to actually put themselves out there. But we can go, we've got lots of examples. If you want to know more about that, you can come up to us afterwards or give us a call later on. We've run over. We have. So,
well, job sharing requires overtime.
That was a 1.2 FTE presentation.